I'm very glad that we organized this moment together with Professor Eli Salzberger from the Haifa Center for European and German Studies, our colleague that has worked with us a lot of projects and visits in Israel with colleagues. It's really an important moment from our center. Thank you very much. And thank you also all the colleagues from the Center for European and German Studies from Porto Alegre, CDEA, and students that help to organize this. I'm Claudia Lima Marques, acting director from the center at the moment. And we have with us Professor Ingo Salet from the Catholic University, and Dr. Christian Kilian, also from our center, and Marcela Joelsen, LLM candidate in our project for master degree in German and European studies. So thank you very much, Eli, for this wonderful moment, and I will pass the floor for our colleague Christian Kilian for the official welcome name of the center.
Okay, on behalf of the Center for German and European Studies, I want to welcome everyone to this third conference of this year. And in the times of pandemic, you have to have this online, but luckily we have the technology to help us. And I would like to thank Professor Salzberger for accepting the invitation to speak to us today. Professor Salzberger, vielen Dank, dass Sie heute bei uns sind. Und I will want to say that this lecture are recorded. And now I can, Marcela, our master student, will introduce Professor Salzberger. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Cristiane. I would also like to thank, on behalf of the students, Professor Eli's presence here with us today. It's a great honor to see you again, Professor. I'm very happy to present you to our public. So, Professor Eli Salzberger was the 15th dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa and the president of the European Association for Law and Economics. He wrote his doctorate at Oxford University on the economic analysis of the doctrine of separation of powers. His research and teaching areas are legal theory and philosophy, economic analysis of law, legal ethics, cyberspace, and the Israeli Supreme Court. He was member of the board of directors of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, of the Public Council of Israeli Democracy Institute, and State Commission for Reform in Performance Rights in Israel. Currently, he is the director of Haifa Center for German and European Studies and the director of the Minerva Center for the Study of the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions. Professor, after this introduction, please feel free to start your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear friends in Porto Alegre. It's really a pity that I cannot be physically with you. Yes. I enjoyed my visit to you 2 years ago very much. One correction, this was a very kind introduction, but I'm no longer the director of the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. I stepped down last March in the right moment. And Professor Stefan Irish, who is a great historian, is my successor, and I'm sure that the cooperation between the two centers will continue this strong and very, very friendly cooperation. So I'm talking now as a member of the law faculty and maybe the director of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under extreme conditions, because we are under extreme conditions globally. This is really the first time in 100 years that we have such a pandemic, really in a global magnitude. And I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli responses to this pandemic, to the crisis, both policy-wise and legal framework. But I want to mention before the background that we encountered this crisis, Israel encountered this crisis in the midst of a very, very serious, maybe the most serious constitutional and political crisis that we ever had. And this crisis began in April 19. General elections did not yield any clear results. The government, led by Netanyahu and backed by the ultra-Orthodox and the right wing, could not really form a government, and the opposition either. It led to a second round of election in September, which yielded the same result, and a third round of elections, which was scheduled to the beginning of March, which took place in the 1st of March, already after the crisis was developing. And this meant that the government in time of the crisis was a take-care government, was actually a temporary government, which complicated the issue. On top of that, the head of the government, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, was indicted for serious III corruption affairs. His trial was supposed to begin on March 17, and this contributed to the political and constitutional crisis. And as we know, emergency times are very, very sensitive times to democratic or anti-democratic revolutions. We all know that from the lesson of the Weimar Republic, that through emergency laws actually managed to conduct an anti-democratic revolution. And very recently, in the Corona crisis, I don't know if you know, but Hungary, which was a democracy, stopped being a democracy because of the usage of, through the usage of emergency powers, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit after the discussion. So this was the context, and we were afraid that the crisis will lead to the government, the politician, actually taking actions not to fight the virus, but to enhance their powers and to weaken the powers of other institutions, especially the judiciary. Finally, a few weeks ago, a government was formed, a unity government. The opposition, Benny Gantz, decided in order to protect the rule of law, he will go into government despite his promise not to sit with Netanyahu, and the political situation stabilized. So this is a very important background issue that one has to take into account when we talk about how Israel confronted the COVID-19 crisis. Now, more generally, I want to talk about policy regarding the COVID-19. And, you know, many states, many countries took very different policies, but I think one can really distinguish between two groups of countries, and I'm afraid that you are not in our group. Those countries that thought that that the COVID is a very serious disease, that it has to be confronted with all the tools, including very strict lockdowns, curfews, social distancing from the very beginning. This is one side of the world. Another side of the world, I think the smaller side of the world, is those countries that, at least initially, undermined the risks of the virus or believed in theory like the herd theory, which we know doesn't work. Just recently, Israel examined a sample of citizens and discovered that less than 20% of the people are infected with the virus. So there is really no chance for herd immunity. Or countries that explicitly or implicitly preferred economic considerations over health consideration, and therefore had a much more relaxed policy regarding the virus. The UK started with such direction. They undermined or believed in herd and made a huge U-turn after the virus really affected very significantly Britain. I would say that Sweden took this policy at the expense of a very, very large number of elderly citizens who died. I will show you the statistics later. And I'm afraid that the US, as well as Brazil, as a meta policy, can be categorized among these countries. Israel, on the other hand, took this very seriously and very, very early. And the policies that were implemented in Israel are very similar to other continental European countries like Germany, Austria. Actually, Israel influenced many European countries in their policies. I think that one should also mention another group of countries, which is very important. These are the East Asian countries that are in the side of those countries who took the virus very seriously, but unlike other countries, European countries, Israel included, were much, much better prepared for the virus because of the SARS in 2003 and the MERS in 2016. And they had much better tools, supply, medical preparation, and they are the champions of the fight in the COVID-19. I'm talking about Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Japan to a certain degree. And this is basically reflected by one of the indexes that we can use to measure the success of fighting the coronavirus. And this is how many deaths were encountered per population in various countries. And the ranges are very, very different. You know, Belgium, Holland, Spain, Italy have more than 500 deaths per million, while the other countries like Israel, we will see in a second, have much, much lower, less than tenths of it, 30 in Israel currently, death toll per population. And this is a very good measure because the measure of infected people is dependent on how many tests are conducted. So this can be a good measure from a health perspective to the degree of success in fighting the virus. You can see here on the table that Brazil is not faring so well, and I'm afraid that you are still in the first big wave, while many countries are already after the big wave, first big wave, and some I will talk about later, like Israel, are already in some kind of a second wave. So you can see in the next slide some other countries, Israel among them, in which the death toll of the virus is much, much lower. And if you see the countries that I mentioned before, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, the statistics there are very, very, very low because they manage very effectively to fight the measure. The Israeli success actually is a consequence of a very early response. As you can see, already on the 2nd of February, when there was this outbreak in Wuhan in China, and only there, the Israeli authorities, the Ministry of Health, decided that all those who are coming back from China have to go into 2 weeks home isolation. This was very early, much earlier than any other country. It was the first country outside, basically, Asia, East Asia, that took such measure. And during the months, more countries were added to the list until in the beginning of March, as you can see, the 7th of March, all those who are coming back from abroad were ordered to stay home 2 weeks for isolation. I was caught. I came back from a conference in Hamburg in late February, and I had to stay in home isolation for 2 weeks. And this was much before any other country took such measures. This was the time in which a lot of cases started to appear in Italy and then later Spain, without really reaction. How this was done legally? This was by an order of the Director General of the Ministry of Health, by powers, legal powers that were granted to him according to the Nation Health Law 1940. It's a very old law from the British time, according to which if there is a pandemic, the Director General of the Ministry of Health can issue a declaration that there is a pandemic and orders of behavior in order to fight this pandemic. This was also the legal base for more restrictions which came in the beginning of March, of gathering of more, prohibition of gathering of more than 100 people. And this was still the stage in which many European countries did not really react, or it was really too late to react. There were, hundreds of flights of tourists, British tourists, going back from North Italy, in which there was already an outbreak, without any requirement when they came to Britain to stay home or to take any other measures. And as you can see, one very interesting, important turning point from a legal perspective, at least, was the 15th of March, in which the orders of the Ministry of Health were actually transferred to emergency regulation by the government. I will say a word about this tool of emergency regulation, but the whole management of the crisis moved from the Ministry of Health to the Prime Minister's office. And the legal tool that was utilized is emergency regulation according to Article 39 of Basic Law of the Government. I will say about it a second in a few minutes when I talk about the legal aspects. What is important now to emphasize that this period from the 15th of March until late April was the toughest period with regard to measures, restrictions, until up to a full closure of the country during the Passover holiday. People were not allowed actually to leave home except to walk the dog hundreds of meters away and so forth. This was also a time in which the general lockdowns changed to a specific areas in which the COVID-19 spread. And these were mainly ultra-Orthodox areas because they didn't observe the regulation regarding gatherings, for example, in synagogues. There was a big outbreak in Jerusalem, in Bnei Brak, and the government resorted to a local lockdowns, more specified and focused. Until full curfew of the whole country was announced for the Passover holiday on the 8th of March. Now, actually, from the beginning of May or end of April, we can see actually relaxation policy, opening of school already in the 25th of April, returning to work, free movement, with very few restrictions. You have to wear masks and you have to maintain 2 meters, but basically the economy is, or the society economy is almost back to normal. And this caused in the last week, this is now the most recent news, the last week was a surge in number of infected people, about 100 or 90, 100 in the last week every day, which prompted other localized steps, but not resort to a general lockdown or downplay of the economy. So this is basically the timeline of the Israeli COVID-19 fight. I know that your timeline is different. I think that in Brazil you are just in the first wave and it will become bigger before it will be contained. We are already in a small second wave and preparing for a serious wave probably in a few months' time when winter begins here. Let me a few words talk about the legal framework. And just theoretically, there are three basic legal frameworks of how to operate under extreme condition, crisis, emergencies. One model is the emergency constitution model that exists in many countries, according to which declaration of emergency gives extra powers to the government, sometimes even legislative power for the time of emergency and a special procedure of decision making. This is one way. The other model is the legislative model. If there is a crisis, a legislation is passed in order to confront the crisis, and without resort, it's a legislative process, without resort to a special emergency tools. This, for example, by the way, was the response of the UK. It enacted very early a corona law which empowered the government to do a lot of steps, but it was not the usage of emergency powers or emergency constitution like we know in many other countries, including in a second I will tell you Israel. The third model is operating totally outside the rule of law, making decisions which are illegal. And there are some even normative justification or arguments in favor of this model. It doesn't corrupt the legal system. You operate outside the rule of law. You get legalization or legitimization afterwards. I'm doubtful about this model. Israel actually resorts to the first and second model. The Israeli emergency constitution is what I mentioned before, section 39 of Basic Law. The government empowers the Knesset to declare a state of emergency, and upon such declaration, the government has powers to issue emergency regulation. As you can see here, the emergency regulation can actually supersede any law. But they are subject to judicial review. They cannot be retroactive and cannot violate human dignity. Declaration of emergency also brings into force legislation, what I call drawer legislation, that was prepared before and can be used only during emergency. An example from the Israeli case is, for example, administrative detention, not in the case of emergency on the background of pandemic, but emergency on the background of security or threat, terror. Administrative detention is a law that is contingent on a declaration of emergency. So basically, the Israeli constitutional structure is well constructed. It is the parliament who declare emergencies only for a year. The government has extra powers, but they are subject to judicial review. In practice, this model in Israel was actually taken advantage of because the declaration of emergency was made in 1948 and was never cancelled or was renewed every year since. This is mainly because many drawer laws that are not connected to emergency, connected to labor relations and other supervision of prices, many such laws are contingent on declaration of emergency. So the ironic or paradoxical situation that we have a continuous emergency declaration on one hand. On the other hand, there was almost no usage of emergency regulations until the breakup of this crisis. Emergency regulation were hardly used in the last 50 years in the history of Israel. But in a sense, this prepared well the judicial system because judicial review of emergency legislation go back to the 50s, 60s. In 1990s, emergency regulation was cancelled by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court also intervened and held that the permanent emergency declaration should be annulled. So the court was, on other background, on security and terrorism background, was much better prepared to deal with such a situation, and I will talk in a second about the court reaction. Anyway, since the beginning of the crisis, various emergency regulations were used by the government, about 70, and the government, by these emergency regulations, actually managed our life, what we can do, what can be open, where we can go and where we cannot go. A lot of applications for judicial review against many of the government measures were launched at the Supreme Court. I would say at least 50 petitions, and I don't know if you know, in Israel, every petition against a decision of a government or any of a public authority goes directly to the Israeli Supreme Court, so it's a very effective and very quick response. The court also had to deal with various applications around the political crisis. It ruled, for example, on the 24th of March that the coalition agreement, on the 6th of May, that the coalition agreement can go ahead, is legal, and that Netanyahu cannot be prevented from being nominated as prime minister despite the indictment. And it ruled on the 24th of March, a month and a half before that, ordering the Speaker of the Knesset to convene the Knesset. They were kind of political tricks. So it had a lot of issues with regard to the political and constitutional crisis, but then it got a lot of cases relating to the corona. I would say that most of the petitions with regard to the measures taken, lockdowns, closure of praying houses, localized curfews, and other aspects of managing the crisis, most of these decisions were by deference dismissed. But two interesting decisions are worth mentioning. One is that regarding electronic surveillance, one of the early measures taken by the government already on the 15th of March was granting power to the police and the General Secret Service to conduct technological surveillance in order to find out contact of infected people with other people in order to put those who were in contact with infected people in isolation or in home isolation. And this authorization prompted a petition to the High Court, which actually accepted it. It ruled out first that the police cannot be authorized by emergency regulation to use such technological means, and also the General Secret Service, unless there is a specific law of the Knesset. Despite the fact that this was the most effective technological tool to fight the virus, basically the two sides of a very effective fight of the virus is very quick and high volume of testing and quick response to bring those people who are in contact with infected people into isolation. So this technological tools and the testing issue are the two crucial issues, despite that the Supreme Court ruled that the authorization of the Secret Service to conduct such technological surveillance is illegal or unconstitutional. Now the government has to bring into the parliament a law in this regard. Another interesting case in which the court interfered was the decision by emergency regulation to basically enforce 70% of the workers in the economy to take unpaid leave because of the shrinkage of the economy and the lockdowns for a certain period. And this including also enforcing pregnant women to go to leave, unpaid leave, and the court ruled that this is unconstitutional or illegal, and that pregnant women cannot be enforced to go to unpaid leave. So these are two interesting interventions of the Supreme Court in light of a lot of issues in which it really refused to intervene. Let me conclude by summarizing what I see the strengths and the weaknesses of the Israeli fight against the contravirus, against COVID-19. I think that on the strengths side, we can mention the very, very early reaction. Actually, as I said before, this reaction prompted some European countries to react in the same manner. A second strength is the relatively very huge volume of testing. Already in the beginning of March, the benchmark was to conduct 10,000 tests a day, and the government met quite well this benchmark. Another strength is a smart shift already in the end of March from general restrictions like curfews, gathering, etc., to localized one where there are outbreaks. And I think another strength is that as we took a very early reaction matter, we were able to open the economy also quite early. The economy is not in full gear yet, and we expect a loss of 5% to GDP, but relative to other countries, this is a good result. On the legal side, the fact that the government, despite the political crisis, the constitutional crisis, the charges against Benjamin Netanyahu, did not resort to any measures which are outside the law, outside the rule of law. On the weaknesses side, I would say that lack of preparation, unlike other countries, especially in East Asia, we were not prepared. There were not drawer programs. Hospitals did not have enough respirators. There was a lot of operations to bring respirators to Israel. So preparation was lacking. Another weakness is that decision-making procedures, institutions to conduct emergency in a very effective and professional way do not paradoxically exist in Israel. And the decision-making process was in the Prime Minister office. And luckily, we were in the hands of good experts, epidemiologists and other scientific experts that gave good advice that were accepted. But this was not because of good institutions, but because of the Israeli flexibility. And I think in results, in consequences, the main weakness is our old age care. Most of the people out of 284 deaths in Israel in total, the vast majority are in older age, especially in protected homes, in old age homes, in assisted living, because tests and very active response was lacking in the very beginning there. So this, I think, is a failure or weakness. And on the legal side, I would say that the very, very wide usage of emergency regulation not bypassing the legislator is a weakness from a democracy and rule of law side. And now on this very minute, there is now a comprehensive Corona bill that is put on the table of the Knesset, which will shift the conduction or the management of the crisis from the government to the legislator, or at least by the legislator authorization. But this is quite late, and I would have hoped to see a better legal tools used, more democratic legal tools used to combat this very, very serious crisis. I think I'll stop here because you might have questions, and I would very happy to learn some comparisons between Israel and Brazil. I know that you are, as I said, in a different stage of the crisis, and I very much hope that you will succeed combating it, at least as Israel succeeded so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Eli Salzberger, for this wonderful and very interesting presentation that show us how important it's also this that is your expertise, the separation of powers, very big issue also in Brazil. We have the luxury to have Professor Ingo Salet with us, so I will give him the floor to begin this discussion. Please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Claudia. Say hello to Eli Salzberger, to Cristiane, to Marcela. It's a pleasure to be with you at this meeting. And I owe Eli Salzberger some comments in our email group, but I will pay the debt, I hope, soon. We're all overloaded with much more work than usually. It's more difficult to prepare classes and so on by the web, through the internet than personally. But Eli, I have some questions, two questions. I think they are important to compare our situation in Brazil with the situation in Israel and other countries. My first concern is that in Brazil we have several, more than 100 Supreme Court decisions related to measures taken by the federal government, state government, and even local governments to fight the pandemic, and even not the omission of measures. No? And the level of intervention in the legislative, but especially administrative, executive powers is very high and increases a lot during this period because, as you in Israel, we have also a highly delicate, you know, that political crisis. It's not from now, it's not new, but it's really increasing and being even frightening, became frightening the last months. So we have a kind of potentialization of escalation of this crisis, really huge economic crisis. So we are sitting on a pover barrel, no? At least to say. So the last decisions from our Supreme Court were very, very strong, and also not only related to measures taken against the corona crisis, but also related to the confrontation between especially the executive power and the judiciary in Brazil. So you mentioned the Supreme Court from Israel has even once declared unconstitutional the exception state, so the emergency state in Israel. We have some decisions even related to the nomination, indication of state ministers and of the federal police chief in Brazil by the executive power. The question is, to what extent is it possible in Israel for the Supreme Court to intervene in such as this at this level in the executive power? That's the first question, because it's leading to really hard confrontation and maybe even a resistance to follow the court decisions, what is very bad. If that resistance can occur in Israel as well. And the second question is about, it's a legal question about the use of the proportionality tests by the Supreme Court in controlling the constitutionality of these measures in Israel. Because I know Aaron Barak has an important book about proportionality. And the question is proportionality a criteria used by the court in Israel?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ingo, for these two very, very important questions. And the position of the Supreme Court is a very, very delicate issue in Israel. You know, one of the characterization of Israel for many, many years was that it has one of the most independent Supreme Courts. The way that judges are appointed, and the way that there are safeguards by tenure and other factors managed to bring the Supreme Court to be a very, very powerful institution. Now, in the last few years, not few years, already decade, there is a constant attacks by the right-wing politician, Netanyahu, in the lead, or his messengers, attacking the fact that the Supreme Court intervenes with the political decisions, that the court power has to be reduced, that the way the judges appointed should be changed. And we had 2 or 3 ministers of justice who actually, the interest was to limit the court. This was the former Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, in the last government until 2019, and the previous Minister of Justice, who was really a messenger of Netanyahu. Now, Netanyahu fights the courts not only on this background, but because of his trial. He wants basically that the trial will not proceed. By the way, by now, the trial opened a week ago, and he was forced to come into court and to hear the reading of the charges. So he failed in this attempt to prevent the trial. But he attacks everything that is connected to prosecution, attorney general, courts, and the court is under massive attack. Now, the coalition that was formed, I don't want to take a political opinion here, but the coalition that was formed, Benny Gantz, who promised not to sit with Netanyahu and to really maintain the rule of law, said, I'm going to this coalition in order to save the legal institutions. And the coalition agreement is drafted in such a way that any decision regarding legal matters, they have to have consensus, both of them. It's not, vote in the government. It's constructed very, very carefully. The new Minister of Justice is from Benny Gantz's party. And it will be a test whether they will succeed to maintain the power of the court. Now, already now, the court was weakened by all this onslaught. And, you know, in the big decision that I referred to, that was given with regard to whether Netanyahu can serve as a prime minister, I would tell you that Aaron Barak would have decided differently. It's a tough legal question because the law says that a prime minister who was convicted has to resign, and it's not saying anything about a prime minister who was indicted before conviction. And from a very formal legal interpretation, you say, you know, the legislator said only a prime minister that was finally convicted cannot serve as a prime minister. But I think that the court could have decided differently. And it decided that Netanyahu it didn't annul or it didn't veto Netanyahu in order to save itself. So there are limits to the courts. A second point related to your first question is whether the court is really powerful enough to intervene. And I think the cases in Brazil and Israel are different in the sense that in Brazil, you go to the court in order to try to enforce the authorities to take measures sometimes, because apparently your leader doesn't believe that COVID-19 is dangerous enough to take measures. And in Israel, it's the opposite. You know, I say to the credit of Netanyahu and his people that they did a very, very thorough job in order to fight the virus, and the applications to the court were because of the restrictions. By the way, unlike in the US, people didn't protest in the streets that synagogue or prayer house are closed. Didn't protest about those issues, protested about democracy, but not about the social distancing. So I think that it's much more difficult to a court to order the government to take measures than to try to examine whether the measures are legal or proportional. And this brings me to your second question. Yes, proportionality is a major tool, but it's a very, very problematic tool in time of such uncertainty. Because, you know, if the government says, you know, we are not allowing more than 10 people together, which means that synagogue, for example, cannot operate. You cannot go to pray in synagogue. Is this proportional or not? The proportionality depends on, of course, on what you expect to be the damage if hundreds of people will pray together. And this is something that is very difficult to calculate. But basically, the court uses the proportionality test with some deference. You know, if the decision was reached by experts and evidence are shown to court, for example, the government of save a lot of lives, and proportionality was employed, and the court decided that it was unproportional. That the government can actually develop applications which are voluntary. Already there is such an applications, phone applications, which are voluntary and can achieve the same thing. And you can incentivize people to download these applications, because this is a condition to go into a mall or to a university or to any public institution or public sphere. So you have tools which are more proportional or less harmful, and the court certainly uses this test.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to hear you, Eli. Very interesting answers, and very, very interesting as well for me as a constitutional lawyer.
Thanks a lot. Marcela, we have questions from the floor, from the students.
Yes, let's start with this question from Bibiana. And I also know that Melanie has a question. Melanie, you can write it down. We can read the question for you, okay? So Bibiana is saying, as we know in Brazil, part of the population lack access to proper healthcare and to sanitary conditions, which is creating a division of who's dying due to the corona and who's not. Israel is a country that has 20% of its population composed by Arab communities. Do you see a difference regarding this contamination, the access of this population to healthcare?
Excellent question. And I think in general, it's true to say that the victims of the corona are usually from disadvantaged groups, whether on socioeconomic ground, poor suffer more deaths than rich, minorities suffer more deaths than majorities. But actually, the Israeli story is very interesting because in the Arab population, there is one of the lowest rates of infected and death. And this is actually a very interesting story which can develop because unlike the ultra-Orthodox that initially disobeyed the orders and gathered, and outbreaks, serious outbreaks were happening there, and among the 285 people who died in Israel, more than I think 2/3 are ultra-Orthodox, which is quite interesting. The Arab population is a very different story. The Arabs, the Muslims had Ramadan just 2 weeks ago, a month of fasting and the end of Eid al-Fitr and they observed actually from below the restrictions. They didn't have the big dinners together, and they are very proud of it. And I think this is also an opportunity for them to go into mainstream civil society better. And so this is a very interesting story and different from other minorities. In the last few days, by the way, there are huge or quite a lot of cases among asylum seekers from Africa in South Tel Aviv. But again, there is a very, very strong reaction, testing and isolation, and nobody is denied care. This is one of the differences between Israel and the US, for example. Nobody is denied care in hospital, even if he or she doesn't have health care. I think,
Sorry, I think we lost the connection with Professor Eli. Marcela, can you ask him to come again?
Yes, let me do something here. Professor Claudia, I will remove him.
Ingo, can you continue to speak about this idea of minorities?
Yes, a little bit, and then I must unfortunately say goodbye because I have another meeting at 2 p.m. It was formally scheduled, so I apologize for this. But yes, what we have in Brazil is also an increasing problem with minority protection, even by the executive power, who is declared and openly declared against indigenous population, and especially indigenous population are more vulnerable to the virus. What's of course logic, because of the conditions they live and the lack of access to medical care, which is much higher in these regions. So that we're also experiencing that in the northern part of the country, especially Amazon and Pará is another northern country which belongs to the Amazon region, are very highly affected by the virus. Another, of course, another circumstance is worth mentioning is that, of course, poor people living in slums and very populated areas are being increasingly affected by the virus, and in this is also in these regions of the big cities that the obedience to the measures is really low. The level of compliance with the measures is lower in the poorer areas than in the rich areas, and also the loosening of the measures is, of course, affecting more and putting in risk and more risk the workers, the labor, the workers. They must go to work, and not, of course, the employers. They are more protected. So we have an increasing process of more affection of these minorities, and also they are not minorities, but more vulnerable people in terms of social and economical, in a social economical sense. I can say that's what's happening in Brazil for now. And Eli and Claudia and Marcela, please forgive me, but
No
I
problem.
must really leave the
That's
leave
okay,
the session,
Professor. No, that's okay. We understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Okay, Professor Claudia. We lost Professor Eli.
Oh.
He did, yeah, I sent him a message, but he didn't. Oh, he's back. He just got back.
Yeah.
Here. Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I was very impressed with the affirmation that emerging periods are the most dangerous times for democracy. I think we have a lot to learn from the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under extreme conditions. No? And perhaps this can be, hello, Eli, welcome back again.
Oh, just turn on your microphone, Professor, please. Oh, yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
was disconnected for some reason.
No problem. And Professor Ingo Salet must go to another meeting, but say that was excellent. And we are talking about how is important this exchange of ideas. And perhaps I was very impressed with your affirmation that emergent periods are the most dangerous times for democracy. And this is a huge subject in Brazil now. We are wonder if we can keep our democracy and institutions going on. So perhaps we can think about another conference from you and from colleagues from the Minerva Center about this specific idea, how is important the institutions during this emergent times. And I think this is, you mentioned Hungary, you know, and I was very interested to know much about this example, but perhaps we can really think to make another conference with Professor Ingo Salet together about institutions, democracy, and extreme conditions, like you said.
Excellent idea. Yes, excellent idea. And we can incorporate our German friends as well.
Yes, this will be wonderful. Let's think about, because this is a very important, and this is for Brazil, and I think it's really the time that our friends help us to maintain democracy and the power of the institutions going on.
Yes, great idea. You know, I think the crisis will change fundamentally many things in the world, from technology to political culture. And this is the time really to try to strengthen democracy, because it's being attacked all over. You know, your big neighbors in North America, what's happening there in the last few days.
Very impressive.
It's really a very big challenge.
Do you want to speak a little about Hungary if you have the time?
About Hungary?
Hungary, yes.
What happened in Hungary is actually that the parliament, which has a strict majority of Orban, passed a law that actually gives Orban unlimited powers for unlimited times.
Oh.
Now they're saying that they are going to abolish the powers, but not yet. And basically this means that he can do everything by decree, rule by decree. He already replaced all the people in key positions, including hospital directors with military people. So he really used already the powers granted to him, and according to Hungary cannot be classified as a democracy anymore.
Oh. Really, very interesting. Yeah. And important example to know more and really to study. But thanks a lot for this. We have one question, I think, Marcela, or
yes,
it's possible. Yes.
Sure.
This question is from Melanie. She's saying, thanks, Professor Eli Salzberger, for this amazing presentation. In your opinion, how has been the conduction of this pandemic crisis by the government and the districts in territorial terms? Oh, okay. So let's just remember that Israel has a small extension comparing to Brazil. Melanie, but let's see what Professor Eli can answer here.
Yeah, Israel is a very small country, so everything is quite centralized. I have to add that despite the political tensions between Israel and Gaza, the Hamas, and Israel and the Palestinian authorities, the Israelis, it was very self-interested possibly, but the Israelis rushed with a lot of medical assistance and guidance and advice, and the outbreak in both the Palestinian territory and in Gaza were very, very small. Actually, the ratio of death toll is even better than Israel. And in this sense, the neighborhood issue, the countries in which you are close to, cooperation is very, very important. By the way, Israel also cooperates a lot with Greece and Cyprus. Greece, Cyprus, Israel are all together in a small corner of Brazil, of territory. But they are talking now about opening a hub of tourism without the requirement for isolation when you go there, kind of free access between countries which managed quite well to fight the pandemic. Also in Greece and Cyprus, the infected and the death toll is very low. And we need in the future globalization and global cooperation, but it will start, I think, with small cooperation of countries which can open the borders between them. The Germans are opening the borders with Austria and Switzerland and Denmark, not with Sweden, by the way, because of what I started with, the Swedish attitude. And this, hopefully, slowly will spread around until we have globalization back. So you asked me about territories and I answer about the whole world, but we hope for a better world.
Well, thank you very much. And let's think about to continue our cooperation. I want to ask Dr. Christiane Kilian if she wants to come back to close the meeting. And I want to use this moment, it's the first moment that we speak.
Yes. Okay.
Just a moment. to thank the cooperation with the Center for European and German Studies from the Haifa University. And also, as a Brazilian, I want to thank the Israeli help during our accident in Brumadinho. We have really a wonderful help, very quick and very efficient to help our people and our environmental in Minas Gerais. So in my name and the name of all students, because sustainability is also a subject of our center, I want to use this moment to thank this really very fast and efficient help that bring together our countries. So, Kilian, please.
Professor Salzberger, I would like to thank you for this interesting lecture, and I hope the next time we'll be here in Brazil and not like this online. And I would like to thank you all to attend in this lecture and to invite you all for the next conference next week at the same time with Professor Laura Mendes. And then thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.
And thank you all the students that helped. Thank you very much.